Stop embarrassing us, Dad! Daniel's shout cut through the glittering ballroom, echoing under the chandeliers. Every eye turned. The music stopped. All I'd done was drop a glass of wine. But the way my son looked at me, the boy I'd raised on a firefighter's paycheck, you'd think I was the shame of his life. Whispers rippled through the tables. A few guests chuckled under their breath. His bride, Emily, tugged at his sleeve, whispered something, then turned to me with a polite, icy smile. You should probably go home, sir. This party isn't really for people like you. I froze. My hands trembled. My eyes burned. I've stared down flames, smoke, and death itself, but never have I felt smaller than I did at that moment. Then a deep, familiar voice came from behind me. Joseph! It's been a long time, hasn't it? I turned. Mrs. Carter, Emily's mother. The same woman I saw the night of the fire in 1995. The fire that took my wife's life. My heart stopped cold. The shame vanished, replaced by a chill running straight down my spine. Because if I was right, my wife's death all those years ago wasn't an accident. Follow for part 2, because what Joseph is about to reveal will shatter the entire family in one single night. I drove back to my old house on the edge of town after the party, my shoes still sticky with spilled red wine. The night breeze carried a faint trace of smoke, that scent that's haunted me my entire life. The smell of fire, of burning wood and melting plastic, of nights spent charging into the flames to pull strangers out, then coming home alone in a smoke-stained uniform, quietly crying where no one could see. I'm 65 now, once a firefighter at Station 42, Boston. 28 years ago, I lost my wife, Linda, in a massive apartment fire on the east side. That night, I was dispatched to the scene, unaware that the woman trapped inside was my own wife. By the time I realized, it was too late. Since then, it's just been me and my son, Daniel. I raised him on a firefighter's salary, picked up extra shifts, sold blood when tuition was due. He was bright, ambitious. For years, I thought he was the greatest gift Linda ever left me. But the older he grew, the further away he drifted. I still remember his 16th birthday. I brought a small cake to his school, nothing fancy, just something I could afford. He saw me standing at the gate, then quickly looked away, pretending not to know me in front of his friends. After class, I asked, "Are you ashamed of me, son?" He didn't answer right away. Then in a flat voice he said, "I just don't want people thinking I'm from the slums." That day, I knew. A wall had begun to rise between us. A wall built from pride and shame. I didn't blame him. I just feared that one day he'd forget the man who once carried him out of the fire. Now, standing before the dusty cabinet, I look at the faded photo of Linda, her smile barely visible through the film of time. I whisper, almost to myself, "I've kept this secret too long, Linda, but tonight I can't stay silent anymore." Because that voice, her voice, Mrs. Carter's, it's awakened the nightmare I've buried for 30 years. That night, the fire in 95, it didn't just burn a building. It burned my life down to the studs. I can still hear the sound, a thunderous crack as the third-floor wall gave way. The smoke was so thick it felt like a blanket suffocating the world. Amid that blackness, a voice screamed for help, a voice that cut through everything because it was so painfully familiar. I ran toward it. "Don't go back in, Joseph. The place is coming down," one of my brothers shouted, grabbing at my sleeve. The captain was radioing for backup. The structure groaned like an animal in pain. Everyone was saying the same thing: "Get out." But something in me kept moving forward. I kicked through a charred door and found a hand, pale, reaching, and stuck out through the flames. I stretched. I almost had it. Then the inferno swallowed that hand, and the doorway disappeared in orange. Afterward, they found Linda's body. They found the silver necklace I'd given her on our wedding day, melted at the clasp. The investigators said it was an electrical short. Accident, they wrote in neat block letters. But I had seen things that night that didn't fit the neat little story. I'd seen the safety warning signs ripped from their mounts. I'd seen a woman in a white coat slip out from behind the caution tape, her face blurred by smoke and shadows. For years I could not place who that woman was. Her silhouette haunted the edges of my memory. Always there, always just out of focus. Tonight, under the chandeliers, when Mrs. Carter's eyes met mine, something old and cold clenched my chest. There was the same look. The same slight turn away, as if avoiding recognition. After the fire, I quit the job that had defined me. I took whatever work I could find: security gigs, driving trucks, cleaning floors at dawn, anything to keep a roof over our heads and put Daniel through college. I thought grit and sacrifice could buy distance from grief. Instead, they carved a canyon between me and my son. Daniel studied economics, walked into a job at a finance firm, and learned to speak the language of success. He learned to say independent like it was armor. He forgot, or decided to forget, the cracked hands that had carried him through childhood. He forgot how many nights his father came home smelling of smoke and regret. I never told him what I believed: that Linda's death wasn't a simple accident, that something had been hidden. I was afraid of what it would do to him. I feared the poison of anger. I feared losing him to a bitterness I'd never wanted for him. But when I saw Mrs. Carter's face tonight, I realized silence had a cost too. Silence could be a form of complicity. Back at my kitchen table, I opened the rusted metal box I'd kept locked up for 30 years. The lock protested, then gave. Inside, the old photo I'd taken of my crew the day before the fire stared back at me, uniforms pressed, faces young, full of promise. In the background, half hidden near the edge of the frame, there she was, a woman holding a building plan. Her face blurred by distance and grain, but the posture was unmistakable. The white coat, the way she turned her head. Seeing it in black and white made something in me stop denying what I had always suspected. It was her, Mrs. Carter, the same woman who smiled politely across the ballroom, who told me, with cold civility, that this party wasn't for people like me. "Linda," I said into the dark kitchen, to a photograph and to the night, and to the woman whose laugh I still heard when I closed my eyes. "I've carried this like a coal in my chest for 30 years. I can't hold it in any longer." My voice was a broken thing. I felt the weight of everything I'd kept: grief, guilt, fear, shift toward a single stubborn resolve. "If I have to lose Daniel for telling the truth," I whispered, "then so be it. I will not let her be buried under a lie again." The next morning, weak winter sunlight slanted through the kitchen window and landed on an untouched cup of cold coffee. I sat there staring at the old photograph, the smoke night memories of '95 replaying in my head as if someone had pressed rewind. My heart pounded with each breath, as if it were trying to tell me, "It's time, Joseph." I pulled on my coat and drove my beat-up pickup back to the old firehouse. The place had been repurposed into a training center. The iron door screeched open and dust rose in a gray cloud. The young man on duty looked me up and down with the cautious curiosity of someone who'd seen one too many strangers wander in. "You need something, sir?" he asked. I showed him my old ID card, the photo worn nearly away on the corner. "Joseph Taylor. I used to work here. I need to see the case file on the Eastwood fire. 1995. He hesitated, then led me to the records room. The smell of old paper and dust hit me like a blow. Rows of files stood on metal shelves, labeled by year. I scanned the spines until my eyes found 1994, then 1996. But 1995, the year that hollowed me out, was a blank space. "No way," I mumbled. The kid frowned. "I've checked the whole archive, sir. It's like that file was moved, or it's gone." In all my years as a firefighter, I'd learned one thing: files don't just go missing, not unless someone made them disappear. And whoever made this one vanish had done it on purpose. I left the station feeling like the room had tilted. On the drive home, I stopped at a small diner for breakfast, more out of habit than hunger. In the corner, framed by a pool of weak morning light, sat Mike, an old teammate, silver hair, a paper folded over his knees. My hand shook when I walked over. "Mike," I said. He looked up slowly. Surprise softened into something like awkward relief. "Joseph! God damn, man. I thought you'd moved away." We sat in silence for a beat, letting the hum of the diner fill the gap. Then I got to it. "I need to know the truth about that fire. The file's gone. Do you remember anything?" Mike lowered the paper, glanced around as if the din's clatter might be listening, and then his voice dropped, gravelly. "There's stuff you don't want to dig up, Joe. That whole thing. It involved people with power. Higher-ups were told to drop the investigation. A construction company got fingered for safety violations. After that, nothing. The file went missing." My mouth went dry. "Which company?" He breathed out a name like a bullet. "Carter Construction." It hit me like a punch. Carter, the same last name as Mrs. Carter. Emily's mother, the woman whose face had thawed something frozen inside me the night before. My fingers tightened until my knuckles showed white. They covered it up, I said without meaning to. The words tasted like ash. Mike shifted in his seat, the guilt clear on his face. I kept a copy. Old habits. I thought, if anything ever went sideways, maybe... He stopped, the sentence unfinished, like whatever came after was a wild thing he was afraid to breathe. Give it to me, I said. He slid a battered leather satchel across the table, hands trembling slightly. Inside was a thick brown envelope with Eastwood, 1995, scrawled on the front. My pulse raced as though I'd sprinted up a ladder. For the first time in decades, something in me stirred that wasn't fear. It was something closer to hope. Keep your head down, Joseph, Mike warned as he pushed the envelope toward me. If you poke this hornet's nest, some folks won't want you walking away from it. I looked out the diner window at a father and child crossing the street, small and ordinary in the harsh light. My chest tightened. I already lost everything, Mike, I said quietly. I don't have much left to lose. He nodded and shut his eyes for a moment, then reached over and patted my hand like we were back on the line together. All right, but be careful. People who bury things don't like being dug up. I clutched the envelope as if it were the last thing I had, which, in a way, it was. Inside could be validation, proof, a miracle for a man who had spent 30 years carrying the smell of smoke and the weight of silence in his lungs. Back at the house that afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table and eased the flap open. The papers inside smelled faintly of old ink and dust, but they were real, brittle copies of reports, yellowed photos, a typed memo with a stamp that read "Confidential." In the margins of one photograph, half hidden in grain and shadow, was the outline of a woman holding a blueprint. The white coat, the angle of her shoulders, it all matched the memory. I pressed my thumb against the photo until it blurred. For the first time since Linda's funeral, anger rose in me that wasn't vague and helpless. It was sharp. It had a name. If these pages could free Linda from the lie that had buried her, I would blow the lid off whatever kept that lie in place. Even if it meant losing Daniel. Even if it meant exposing a family who'd learned too well how to turn their faces away. The choice was no longer whether to act. It was how. By the time I got home, dusk had bled into night. The brown envelope was still in my hand, warm from the heat of my palm, as though it carried a pulse of its own. Every step across the worn hallway echoed with the ghosts of a past I'd tried to bury for 3 decades. When I opened the door, Daniel was already there. He sat on the edge of the couch, still in his suit, tie loosened but face taut. The amber lamplight carved his features into something older, harder. I just got a call from Emily's mother, he said flatly. She told me you went to the old firehouse today. You were asking about the 95 fire? I hung my coat on the chair. Yes, I needed to. Something about that night never added up, Daniel. Your mother... Stop it, he snapped, his voice cutting through mine. That was 30 years ago. Mom died in an accident. You can't keep digging at old wounds because of some obsession. I went silent. The way he said Mom and Dad in the same breath, cool, detached, made my chest ache. You don't understand, I said slowly. I saw that woman, Emily's mother. She was at the fire. She was there, Daniel. Enough! He shot to his feet. His voice trembled, not with fear, but with anger. Do you even know what you're doing? You're not just wrecking yourself. You're wrecking me. Emily is going to be my wife. Her family are partners at the firm. If they think you're some paranoid old man, I lose everything. A bitter smile flickered on my face. So your reputation is worth more than the truth? Daniel's eyes, once so much like Linda's, had gone cold. Reputation keeps me alive, Dad. Truth doesn't pay bills. Truth doesn't build anything. Truth destroys. I couldn't answer. Not because I was angry, but because I realized in that moment that the boy who once wore my helmet and sat on the fire truck had grown into a man I didn't recognize. I don't want to hear any more, he said, voice dropping. If you keep this up, if you keep dragging this into my life, I'll have to pretend you don't exist. The door clicked shut behind him, the lock snapping like a gun cocking. Silence rushed in, thick and suffocating, broken only by the steady tick of the wall clock. I sat at the kitchen table and opened the envelope. Inside were brittle files, yellowed pages, black and white photographs. One of them showed the Eastwood building before the fire. and in the corner of the frame, a construction sign. Carter Construction. Project Overseer, Margaret Carter. I drew in a sharp breath. That name, Margaret Carter. No more doubts. I folded the photo, my hands trembling. In that moment, my phone rang. The screen read, "Unknown number." I answered. A woman's voice came through, low, husky, and sharp as a blade. "Mr. Taylor, stop. Some things are meant to stay buried. Take one more step, and you'll regret it." The line went dead. I sat frozen, the phone slick in my grip. Not only had I begun to remember the past, someone else had begun to watch me. Outside the window, night draped itself over the city like a sheet of ink. In the distance, the red glow of a parked car blinked. Its headlights flashed once, then went dark again. A warning. I closed my eyes and drew a long breath. "Linda," I whispered into the dark, "if you're listening, give me a little more courage, because I know I'm about to touch something they've spent 30 years trying to hide." The clock ticked on, loud as a heartbeat. My fingers tightened around the envelope until the edges cut into my palm. Fear and grief tangled inside me, but under it all was something harder, sharper. The thing that had once made me run into flames. Resolve. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like the past was hunting me. It felt like I was about to hunt it back. 2 days later, I drove out to the south suburbs where Mike lived with his wife. His little house huddled against the edge of the woods, the smell of wood smoke drifting from the kitchen like a quiet promise of warmth. I hadn't even knocked before he opened the door, as if he'd been waiting. "I figured you'd come," he said, tired and guarded at once. "Heard about the calls. Someone's been warning you off." "I've had one," I admitted. "But I can't stop, Mike. I need to know the truth." He led me inside, poured coffee, and disappeared into a back cupboard. He returned with a small metal box, its padlock old and pitted. He fed a key into it, turned, and the lid gave with a reluctant clink. Inside lay a handful of cassette tapes, a stack of Polaroids, and a cracked leather notebook that smelled of old ink and oil. "I've kept this stuff for 30 years, he said. "Back then I meant to hand it up, but an officer warned me, if I did, I'd lose my job. Or worse." I took the notebook in my hands and flipped through the pages. Dates, times, addresses, shorthand scribbles crowded every margin. My eyes snagged on lines written in a hurried, angry hand. "Safety violation report. Third floor wiring not up to code. Carter Construction refused repairs. Cost overrun dispute. Internal engineer filed complaint subsequently dismissed." My breath stopped. "They knew," I said low. "They knew and still let those people live there?" Mike nodded. "They did. And the man in charge of site safety that day, Margaret Carter, I saw her signature on the cert that said the building was safe for occupancy. The original files disappeared after that." My fingers tightened on the notebook until the leather creaked. Pieces I'd juggled for years, rumors, half-remembered silhouettes at the edge of the smoke, began to click into place. It wasn't an electrical fault that killed Linda and 11 others. It was a choice. Corners cut, warnings ignored, money weighed over lives. Mike blew out a breath like a man exhaling a long-held secret. After that, Carter Construction rebranded, became Carter Holdings, and now, the largest shareholder lit is Emily Carter, Margaret's daughter. That's why Daniel freaked out. "You're not just accusing a dead company. You're up against a whole empire." The name hit me like a physical thing. Carter. Margaret. The same woman who'd smiled across the ballroom and turned away so politely that night. "I get why he's afraid," I said. "But fear isn't a reason to let them bury the truth." Mike slid another envelope across the table. "This is a copy of the final inspection report, Margaret Carter's signature on the line. I kept the originals. But if you blow this up into the open, they'll come for you. They've got money, lawyers, reach." I picked up the envelope and felt its weight like a stone on my chest. Heavy, necessary. For the first time in 3 decades, the anger inside me stopped being raw and directionless. It sharpened into something with an edge. "I'm not scared anymore, Mike," I said. "They can have everything. They don't have Linda." He looked at me, and some of the old camaraderie returned, softened by years and wear. "You're the same stubborn son of a—" He smiled, a weary, fond twist. "You always were." "Not reckless," I corrected. Not anymore, just determined. Before I left, he put a hand on my shoulder like he used to when we were a team. If you need a witness, he said quietly, I'll stand up. I've shut my mouth for 30 years. I can't do that again. I drove back toward the city with the envelope beside me on the passenger seat, the papers inside shifting with each bump. The sky over Boston was the color of wet steel, the wind sweeping down like a broom across the past 30 years, shaking dust loose. As I merged onto the highway, the mass of the evidence felt less like something that could be thrown away, and more like a ledger of debts owing to the dead. Each document, each signature was a tally. Margaret Carter's name on a line that lied about safety, memos that vanished, a corporation's decisions that had traded human lives for profit. For a long while I watched the road and let the car carry me forward. The city lights rose up, a map of promises and compromises. As I drove, images kept returning. Linda's laugh, the way she tucked a stray curl behind her ear, the last time I held her hand. All of them braided into a single, stubborn conviction. I would not allow their names to be scrubbed from history. When I pulled into my driveway, the envelope lay on my lap like a pledge. The fight had begun. I could feel it in the hum of the engine, in the way my hands no longer trembled the way they used to. Steadier now, steadier for a different reason. I lifted the lid of the envelope one more time, letting the papers breathe in the kitchen light. There, in black and white, a signature hovered on the page, Margaret Carter, neat and official and damning. Outside, wind rattled the old maple. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed. Inside, I set the papers on the table and sat down. The city had many quiet, ordinary days left to live. Tonight was not one of them. I got home after dark. The house was a cave of shadows, the desk lamp throwing a thin pool of light across the scattered papers. Mike's evidence lay there on the wood, cold, accusing, heavy. I unfolded each photograph slowly. In one of them, I stopped short. The image was grainy, snapped from a distance. It showed Eastwood Apartments in the hours before the fire. Light smoke curling from the ground floor. A couple of people bent over an electrical panel as if checking something. At the edge of the frame, just inside the restricted area tape, stood a woman in a white coat and a hard hat, her blonde hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. I put the old magnifying glass to the print. My hand trembled. The angle of the jaw, the slight set of the mouth, the teardrop silver earring catching a sliver of light. There was no mistaking it. Margaret Carter. My breath hitched. A slow vertigo slithered down my spine. In my mind, Linda's face rose up, her gentle laugh, the way she'd fastened the silver necklace around my throat on our wedding day. She was gone. The one who had stood responsible, alive, polished, moving through my son's life like some kindly matriarch, had never been held to account. I slammed my palm down on the table. That's enough, Linda. I won't let you be buried twice. That night, I drove straight to a small downtown newsroom to see Sophie Allen. She was a young reporter I'd pulled from a school fire 15 years ago, small, fierce, and she'd once told me I'd saved her life. I owed her more than a debt. I knew she would listen. She opened the door in a robe, surprised to find me at her doorstep. Good God, Mr. Taylor, what are you doing here at this hour? I set the envelope on her kitchen table. It's the truth, Sophie. The Eastwood fire in '95 wasn't an accident. I have proof. I want it published. Her face tightened as she slit the envelope. She flipped through the photos, then the notebook pages. When she reached the picture of Margaret Carter, she fell silent. Then she looked up at me. Carter? She said, tasting the name. That's Emily Carter's mother. Emily. She's the one getting married to Daniel Taylor, right? I nodded. Yes, Daniel's my son. The two of us sat in a thick, private quiet. Sophie's voice came out softer than I expected, a little unsteady. If I run this, she said, I'll be taking on one of the biggest corporations in the state. I could lose my job. They'll sue. They'll try to bury me. She swallowed. You understand what that means? I do, I said. But I don't need someone to defend me. I need someone brave enough to speak the truth. Sophie looked at me for a long time, measuring. Then she straightened. All right, I'll investigate, but I need verification. Witnesses, documents, timestamps, and you have to be ready. When this goes public, eyes will be on you, on your son, on everything. I let out a small, tired laugh. I've been ready for 30 years. Let them look. On the drive home, October cold cut through the car vents. It felt like someone was watching me from the periphery, but the feeling didn't stop me. All that mattered now was making peace for Linda. When I opened my front door, a white envelope was tucked under the mat. No return address. Inside was a glossy photo of me and Daniel from the engagement party, caught smiling, off guard, and a message scrawled in red across the bottom. If you go public, you will lose your son. I stood there with the picture in my hands, the threat as slick and ugly as fresh blood. My throat tightened, then cleared. I lifted my gaze to Linda's framed photo on the wall. I lost you once, I told the room. I won't let them take the rest of him. I fed the threatening note into the kitchen sink and watched the lighter flame eat the paper until only ash floated in the basin. The color of the embers stung the dark like a promise. Tomorrow Sophie would run the story. I would hand over the rest of the files. I thought of the faces in the photos, Linda among them, frozen in an ordinary life that had been broken by greed and cowardice. I thought of Daniel, of how easily a son could be persuaded to turn away from his father. Whatever would come in the morning, lawsuits, threats, lost friendships, the world's eyes, could not outweigh the truth. Not now, not after 30 years of quiet. I set the remaining photographs in a neat stack, smoothed each page with a trembling hand, and put them back into the envelope as if tucking something sacred into a coffin. I locked the box in the top drawer and set the key beside it. The house felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls were bracing for a storm. Outside, the city breathed and moved on. A distant siren wailed a single note into the night. Inside, I sat at the kitchen table and let the gravity of my choice settle. By dawn, the story would be on someone's front page. By noon, the world would be louder. By evening, my family, my son, might be gone, but the photograph of Margaret Carter was on my table. The signature on the inspection report was in my hand. For the first time since the fire, the scales tipped toward justice. I closed my eyes and thought of Linda, of her small hand on my chest as she smiled that morning so long ago. I'm coming for you, I whispered into the dark, not to take you back, but to bring your name home. The wedding glowed under a glass dome, the light of 1,000 chandeliers turning everything into a movie scene. Laughter and the clink of crystal rang like bells. I stood at the edge of it all, feeling like an extra looking in from outside the frame. Daniel and Emily stood in the center of the floor, hand in hand, eyes shining so brightly it hurt to look. They were building a world I could never enter. I hadn't planned to come. Emily's mother had done everything to make sure I wouldn't cause a scene. But Sophie, the reporter, had called. Her article was scheduled. If you're going to tell the truth, do it where they can't pretend it isn't happening, she said. She was right. And as Daniel tightened his grip on Emily's hand, a cold resolve began to move through me. It had to be here. It had to be now. When the music faded and the MC invited guests to toast, I stepped forward. Heads turned, whispers rose. Daniel's face drained of color. Shame cracked open into anger. Emily clutched his arm and whispered, "Mrs." Carter stood near the dais, her expression gracious, but her eyes cold as polished steel. I walked to the little podium, laid my hand on the microphone. At first, only a low murmur drifted across the hall. Then I opened the envelope and drew out the Polaroid, the ember I'd kept in my chest for 30 years. "Excuse me," I said, my voice hoarse but steady. "I have something to say. And I want to say it here, in the place where everyone is celebrating a new beginning. People deserve to know the truth before a wedding turns it into a curtain." A few sighs, a couple of groans. Daniel strode toward me, his face burning. "Dad, stop. Don't ruin this night." I looked into his eyes that had once looked at me like a hero, and saw only blades. "I'm not here to ruin anything," I said. "I'm here to bring the truth into the light. For Linda, my wife, and for the people who died in the rubble." I held the photo up. The room went still. The picture was blurry, but in the magnifying glass of memory every detail sharpened. A woman in a white coat standing by a restricted area sign, tilting her head toward a set of building plans. Margaret Carter. Whispers rose into a gasp. "This," I said, voice shaking but firm, "is proof. She was at the site before the building burned, and the safety certificate bears her signature. I could feel the room's eyes latch onto the photo like a trap door swung open, spilling old secrets into daylight. Mrs. Carter moved forward, a smile fixed on her lips but panic flickering behind her eyes. "Joseph, you're inventing stories," she said, still playing the dignified matriarch. "To do this here, on my daughter's wedding day, is beyond the pale." Emily turned to Daniel, whispering louder now. Daniel's hands clenched white. "Stop this. I told you. Leave the past buried," he hissed. Each word was a blade, but for once I wasn't bleeding under their stares. I'd lived under those looks for 30 years. I leaned closer to the mic, voice rising. The woman in this photograph was responsible for safety oversight on the Eastwood project. The documents show Carter Construction deliberately ignored violations to avoid losses. Margaret Carter signed off on safe for occupancy knowing repairs hadn't been made. The result was Linda and 11 others dead. That was not an accident. The hall erupted. People shouted. Someone began to cry. Others murmured, "It can't be true." Daniel stepped back, his face gone pale, like someone whose foundation had just been yanked away. Emily covered her face, tears spilling, caught between defending her family and absorbing the truth cracking open before her. Mrs. Carter clutched her daughter's arm, voice snapping tight. "This is defamation. We'll sue this man for slander." A few polite claps rose from a knot of wealthy guests, their exhalations almost relieved to have a party line. Across the room, another cluster of guests, some whose families had suffered from Carter's cost-saving practices, began inching closer, their eyes glinting with the possibility of justice at last. Sophie stood in the corner, notebook in hand, her gaze steady and bright, ready to release her story into the world. Daniel looked at me like an enemy. "Do you know what you've done?" he shouted. "You're going to destroy both families. You're wrecking my future." I answered with a question, not an accusation but a plea to his conscience. "A future built on the pain of others. Is it worth it, Daniel? Do you want to stand on the death of your own mother?" Silence fell like a curtain. Somewhere a glass shattered. Someone else dialed a phone. And I knew as I stepped back from the podium that nothing in this room would ever be the same again. I had tipped a stone off the mountaintop, and it was rolling now, unstoppable, tearing through everything in its path. The air inside the crystal hall felt suddenly thin, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. The music had stopped completely. All that remained was the frantic click of camera shutters from curious guests, and the shallow, nervous breaths of people witnessing something they never imagined would happen at a wedding. Emily, in her flawless white gown, stood frozen at the center of the floor. The chandelier light scattered across her pale face like shards of glass. On one side stood her powerful mother. On the other, the man she was about to marry. And across the room, Joseph, the aging father who carried the truth like a knife driven straight into a wall of lies. Mom, Emily's voice trembled. "What he said, is it true?" Margaret Carter tried to hold her smile, but her voice cracked as she answered, "Of course not, darling. Don't listen to him. The man's bitter. He lost his wife, he's broken, and now he wants to drag us all down with him." Her words lashed through the silence like a whip, but before she could speak again, an older man among the guests rose to his feet. "I worked in the city's building inspection board in 1995, he said, voice wavering. "What Mr. Taylor's saying, it's not wrong. Carter Construction was accused of cutting corners back then. The case files disappeared within 2 weeks." A ripple tore through the crowd. Half of them turned toward Margaret. The rest looked to Daniel, waiting for his reaction. Daniel stepped forward, his face flushed with fury and shame. "Everyone, please, listen to me," he shouted, voice cracking. "My father, he's delusional. He's been living in grief for too long. He's obsessed, making up stories. None of this is real." Joseph met his son's eyes. His expression softened, not with anger, but with a kind of boundless sorrow. "Daniel," he said quietly, "you don't have to believe me. Just look. Look at that photograph. Tell me, who do you see? Do you think I invented her face out of thin air?" Daniel's hands curled into fists. "I don't care who she is. None of this matters to me. You promised you wouldn't ruin my life again, and here you are. From this moment on, I'm done. I'm not your son anymore." The words hit like an explosion. Guests gasped. Someone dropped a glass, and Joseph, the man who'd run into burning buildings without fear, stood as if he'd taken a blow straight to the chest. Not from a fist, but from the voice of the boy he'd once carried on his shoulders. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Daniel turned away, reaching for Emily's hand. "Let's go. We don't need to stay here." But Emily didn't move. Her eyes darted between the two people who had shaped her life, the mother who'd raised her, and the man who was supposed to become her father-in-law. Both trembling, both broken, for different reasons, one out of guilt, the other out of grief. "I need to hear the truth, Mother," Emily said. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the room. "If he's lying, look at me. Look me in the eyes, and tell me you weren't there." Margaret swallowed hard, gaze flicking away. That one tiny movement, that hesitation, was enough. The crowd understood before she said a word. A wave of murmurs spread, swelling like a gust of wind through the hall. Then a young woman stood up from the corner, holding her phone high. "I'm Sophie Allen, Boston Tribune," she said clearly. "I can confirm Mr. Joseph Taylor's claims are true. We have the records, and copies of the inspection report bearing Mrs. Carter's signature. The story goes live tomorrow morning." Margaret's face drained of color. Emily covered her mouth, sobbing. Daniel's eyes went red, wild. "You people, you're destroying us," he shouted. "Dad, I hate you. I'd rather lose everything than watch you do this." He grabbed Emily's hand again, but this time she pulled away. "No, Daniel. You need to know. You can't spend the rest of your life pretending." The whispers swelled into chaos. Guests pulled out phones, recording the scene. A group near the back began shouting accusations at Margaret, recalling past scandals, families who'd lost homes during Carter Holdings' redevelopments. At the corner, the hotel manager fumbled with the sound system, trying to lower the mic volume. It was useless. The room had become a battlefield. Truth on one side, reputation on the other. Margaret screamed, "Stop! All of you! Stop!" But her voice drowned under the roar of 100 others. Joseph stood amid the storm, watching his son one last time. Daniel's eyes were full of rage and confusion, the look of a man who'd just watched his world collapse. "You'll regret this, Daniel," Joseph said, his voice breaking but steady. "Not because of me, but because you chose to stand with a lie." Daniel didn't answer. He took Emily's hand and led her toward the doors, their footsteps sharp against the marble. The crowd parted, half turning toward Joseph, the father who had dared to speak, and half toward Margaret Carter, the woman who'd ruled the city with wealth and fear. As the grand doors slammed shut behind them, Joseph turned back to the table where the photograph still lay under the flashing lights of a dozen cameras. He didn't know it yet, but that single image, of an old man standing alone in a room full of broken glass and exposed lies, would be on the front page of every newspaper the next morning, and from that moment on, the city itself would have to choose which side of the fire it stood on. Morning hit Boston like a thrown stone. The front page of the Tribune screamed across newsstands, "1995, fire not an accident, powerful figure accused of cover-up." Beneath the headline was the photo that had torn the wedding apart. Me, hand raised, that faded Polaroid held up like a challenge, Margaret Carter's pale face in the background, and Daniel turning away. Phones rang off the hook. Cable reruns looped the shaky wedding footage until it was 100 different versions. On social media, the clips spread like fire, some calling me a deluded old man, others calling me a stubborn hero who refused to be silenced. Reporters camped outside my house, lenses trained at my door like a line of accusing fingers. I stepped outside with the files in my hands, each page a small, terrible truth. "Mr. Taylor, do you have more evidence?" A camera shoved in my face demanded. "Aren't you worried about being sued?" Another shouted. "Do you think your son will ever forgive you?" Someone else asked, softer but sharper. I answered once, slow and clear. "I'm not doing this for forgiveness. I'm doing it for the people who can't speak for themselves." By afternoon, Margaret Carter had gone on the offensive. She appeared on national television flanked by a litigator in a dark suit and a posture practiced for cameras. Her voice, precise and composed, delivered the family line. "Mr. Taylor is a grieving man. We sympathize with his loss, but we won't tolerate deliberate defamation aimed at my family's name." Within hours, her lawyers delivered a notice to my door. Cease and desist, plus the threat of a defamation suit and claims of illicitly obtained materials. My hands trembled when I read the envelope. not from fear so much as from the grim realization that the ground beneath me had shifted into a battlefield of lawyers and money. Then Sophie came by with a stack of printouts like reinforcements. She set the papers on my kitchen table and didn't waste words. "You're not alone," she said. "Victims are coming forward. Former employees. Even someone who used to work at the inspection board. We've got testimony, old memos, leaked messages." She pushed a USB drive across the table. "And there's more, if you want to keep going." One by one, she laid out what the newsroom had pulled together. Photos, faded memos, notes from whistleblowers. Each small thing, when placed beside the others, made the picture less a rumor and more a crime scene. My chest tightened with a mixture of dread and relief. For the first time in 30 years, the silent ledger in my head had faces and dates and signatures. Daniel went quiet. His calls stopped. The house that had been full of that steady, complicated noise between father and son was suddenly a hollow echo chamber. I listened to the clock with the kind of attention people give a heart waiting for news. I knew where he'd gone, somewhere to hide from the storm his father had brought. It was an instinct I remembered well: run from the fire to save yourself. But truth, I'd learned, has a way of catching up. 3 days later, the old evidence started to show itself publicly. A grainy audio clip surfaced. My old partner Mike's voice, recorded in a long, raw interview. "Top brass took money to look the other way," he said on the tape. "Margaret Carter signed off on the safety certificate even though the wiring wasn't finished. After the fire, the files were removed from the archive." The city felt the jolt. Talk radio hosts screamed. Editorials fanned the flames. The evening news ran a special. Carter Holdings under fire, but the other side had its weapons too. That same broadcast carried the counter-narrative the company had prepared, a polished package painting me as a man with a troubled past, the sort of man a headline could turn from hero to cautionary tale. They rolled footage of my younger self in a fire helmet placed under a caption asking, "Joseph Taylor, hero or hazard?" They were trying to drown the truth in character assassination. They were throwing mud and hoping it would stick. I sat in my kitchen watching the smear strategy unfold on the television, rain tapping against the panes. Exhaustion sat heavy in my bones like an old muscle ache, but below it something steadier, a commitment that had hardened into resolve. I thought of Linda, the way she would laugh when I messed up a recipe, the way she'd pinch my sleeve and tell me not to take on the world alone. They could smear me, they could spin stories, they could try to ruin my name. They could not erase what happened. They could not put Linda back into the ground twice. Outside, the wind ripped newspapers from stoops and sent them skittering like dead birds. A tabloid picture of me, alone at the wedding podium, slammed across the morning's front page. The city talked. Good people called to offer help. Others called to threaten. A lawyer's letter landed on my porch, thick with legalese. Someone left an anonymous note under my mat. "Leave this alone." Inside, Sophie kept working. The newsroom churned. Anonymous tips, old-timers coming forward with names and dates, a former employee offering to testify. The story had torn open enough to expose rot, and now it bled through the cracks. People who had been muzzled for decades were coughing up the truth. I slept in fits. When I woke, the fear returned in new forms. Visits from investigators, lawyers, reporters who wanted quotes, and those who wanted to film me as a curiosity. But at night, when the house was quiet and the city smelled of wet tar and distant exhaust, I allowed myself a private reckoning. I had traded the safety of silence for the raw air of truth, and the cost was real. I'd lost my son's presence, at least for now. I'd made powerful enemies. But there was a justice in the work, ragged, imperfect, necessary. They would come at me with everything they had: money, lawyers, reputation, a PR machine designed to spin everything until nothing resembled the original fact. But there was one thing they couldn't buy: the memory of the people who died in a building a long time ago. I could see their faces as clearly as if it were yesterday, so I kept the files close, and I kept going. The story had become bigger than a wedding, bigger than a family. It had become a reckoning. As the storm gathered momentum, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Not victory, not yet, but the small, stubborn warmth of righteousness. The city was watching now. The darkness was mobilizing. And in the middle of it, the old firefighter who'd learned to stand in the smoke steadied his breath and prepared for whatever fire would come next. The public storm had just begun to settle. I thought maybe, Just maybe I could catch my breath. Then, that morning, the doorbell rang. A man in a gray suit handed me a thick envelope. Summons from the Federal Court of Massachusetts, he said. I tore it open. My hands froze at the first line. Plaintiff, Margaret Carter. Defendant, Joseph Taylor. Charges, defamation, invasion of privacy, distribution of classified materials. At the bottom was the signature of Hayward Bloomfield, Massachusetts' biggest, most ruthless law firm. I exhaled slowly and folded the paper back up. I knew Margaret wouldn't stay quiet, but I never expected her to strike this fast. That afternoon, my bank account was frozen. A bland notification arrived saying my funds were under verification for an ongoing investigation. A lifetime of savings, my small pension, odd job paychecks, suspended, not a dime accessible. That night, Sophie came over. She found me sitting at the table under a dim lamp, the legal papers crumpled in front of me. "They've started, haven't they?" she asked. I nodded. "They've locked every account. I can't afford a lawyer. Mike's sick. He can't testify. They know I'm alone." Sophie gripped my hand. "No, you're not alone. The Boston Tribune has assigned their own attorney. They believe in my article, and they believe in you." I looked at her, gratitude flickering in my eyes. But I also knew taking on Margaret Carter wasn't simple. This woman wasn't just wealthy, she was a force. She knew how to make people disappear, and no one dared to ask how. 3 days later, the court officially opened the case. The media exploded. Carter Holdings sues former firefighter, a clash of power and conscience. Across town, Margaret held a press conference, stepping out of a black limousine as camera flashes strobed around her. "We have nothing to hide," she declared proudly. "My company has been transparent for 30 years. Mr. Taylor's accusations are fabrications meant to grab attention. He will be held accountable." Within hours, Carter Holdings stock ticked upward. Financial channels praised Carter's leadership in crisis. And me? A 65-year-old man turned into a hashtag. One blogger sneered, "Joseph Taylor, mad father or sympathy hustler?" Another outlet leaked photos of my tiny house with the caption, "Living in poverty. Does he have a financial motive for attacking Carter Holdings?" I read it all. Said nothing. I've lived with fire my whole life. The only difference now is this fire comes from fingers on keyboards. That night, someone pounded on my door. When I opened it, no one was there. Just an envelope on the steps, fluttering in the wind. Inside was a photo of me and Sophie at a coffee shop. On it, scrawled in jagged handwriting, "We know who she is. Watch yourself, Mr. Taylor." I looked up into the dark. Far off, a pair of headlights sat still, then slid away into the night. A thought hit me hard. They don't just want me silent. They want me afraid. I stepped back inside, switched off every light, and left only the small glow at Linda's altar. "You see this, Linda?" I whispered. "They can take everything from me, but they will not take the truth." I opened the cabinet, pulled out Mike's case file, checked every page, every photograph. Then I made my decision. I would stand in court alone, no more retreating. The next day I called the courthouse and filed my countersuit. In the box marked "Reason for Counterclaim," my hand trembled but my writing held steady. Because justice burned once, I will not let it burn again. 2 weeks later, a second summons arrived. Tentative court date, February 15th. I was old. My health failing. Yet every morning at 5 I sat at my kitchen table, handwriting my own defense. Sweat stained the crooked lines, but every word carried the only things I still had: the truth and faith in justice. Sophie begged me to hire a lawyer. "You can't go into court alone," she said. "Margaret's got a team of a dozen, each one with a role. You're just one man. They'll crush you." I stayed silent. My money was frozen, every small asset seized for investigation. All I had left was the old house and a handful of blurry case files. That afternoon, at the courthouse to file my counterclaim, I met Ethan Miles, a young attorney, maybe 30, thin frame, bright eyes, stepping out of the courtroom next door. He recognized me from the news and came over. "You're Joseph Taylor, right? The father from the Carter case?" I nodded. "That's me. And you are?" "I'm Ethan. My mother worked at the Eastwood plant. She lost her job after the fire. I've always wanted to know what really happened." We sat down on an old wooden bench in the hall. Ethan told me he'd been following the case and couldn't stand on the sidelines anymore. "You won't have to pay me," he said. "I'll take this pro bono, for justice, and for the people everyone's forgotten." I looked at him. And in those young eyes, I saw the spark I once carried myself, a belief in right and wrong, before life wore it down with fear. I shook his hand. Thank you, Ethan. We'll fight this. Meanwhile, across town, Margaret Carter was setting her machine in motion. She met with the lead partner at Hayward Bloomfield, a man who'd won billion-dollar cases. I don't care if he's right or wrong, Margaret said, voice like steel. I want him silent, permanently. At the same time, she called two judges she'd once courted at Carter Holdings fundraisers, inviting them to a private dinner. Days later, Ethan got notice. My counterclaim was postponed indefinitely for insufficient evidence. He slammed his hand on the table. They're playing dirty, Joseph. This is blatant interference. I gave a tired smile. I once saw a fire spread through 3 floors from a single cigarette ember. You know what I did? I didn't scream. I just found the water to put it out. They can stall us, but they can't smother the truth. Ethan nodded slowly. He suggested we dig for more witnesses. That's when I remembered Mike, my old friend in the hospital. I went to see him. Mike was frail, breathing through oxygen tubes, but when he saw me, he gripped my hand and pressed a tiny USB drive into it. I recorded my conversation with the safety inspector back in '95, he whispered. He admitted he was forced to sign a fake report. This is our last card. I held it like it was Linda's beating heart. Rest now, Mike. I swear you won't die in vain. On my way home, the TV erupted with breaking news. Carter Holdings was now suing the Boston Tribune for spreading false information. Major investors pulled out, pushing the paper to the brink of bankruptcy. Sophie was suspended from her job. The whole city seemed muzzled. Every network stopped mentioning the Eastwood fire. Articles vanished from the internet within hours of posting. I knew who was behind it. Margaret Carter was no longer just a powerful woman. She was the hand moving the entire system. I turned to Ethan. We're out of options. If we can't win with the media, we'll win with evidence. His eyes burned bright. Then let's take that recording to court. Let her hear her own lies echo in public. I looked toward the window where the last light of day fell across Linda's photograph. Linda, I'm getting closer. The first day of trial broke under a gray February sky. Boston looked like it was wrapped in lead. I walked into the federal courthouse, gripping the USB Mike had left me, the only piece of evidence that could change everything. Ethan walked beside me, his suit slightly wrinkled, glasses sliding down his nose, but his eyes burned bright, like fire refusing to die. Across the courtroom, Margaret Carter made her entrance in a navy blue dress, pearl collar gleaming under the lights. She smiled at the reporters, waving like a politician who owned the room. Behind her stood 3 attorneys from Hayward Bloomfield, each carrying a stack of files thick as bricks. When the session began, the judge, a gray-haired man with a gravelly voice, asked both sides to present. Margaret's lead lawyer rose, speaking smoothly, coldly, like oiled steel. Your Honor, my client is being accused without foundation, based on fabricated materials and statements from an individual with a clear personal motive. We move to strike all so-called evidence, including the audio recording the defense intends to submit, on grounds of unclear origin and possible tampering. Ethan shot up. Objection, Your Honor. The recording comes directly from Mr. Michael Hudson, a former Boston firefighter who participated in the original 1995 investigation. This is key evidence proving a systematic cover-up. The judge cut him off, voice dry. Is Mr. Hudson present to authenticate this evidence? No, Your Honor. He's hospitalized, critical condition. Then, bang, the gavel fell. The court cannot accept the recording until the witness can testify in person. Ethan froze. I saw his shoulders tremble. Across the room, Margaret tilted her head and smiled, barely, just enough for me to notice. And I knew then she'd spoken to someone long before this hearing began. After recess, the court moved to evaluate the defendant's motive. The plaintiff's team unleashed a flood of documents, cropped social media posts, photos of me talking to reporters, and sound bites they called proof of the defendant's pursuit of media attention for personal gain. I sat still, every word slicing like a blade. But Ethan didn't let them dominate for long. He stood, voice echoing clear through the courtroom. Your Honor, this man spent his entire life running into fires to save others. He asks for nothing, nothing but the truth about his wife's death. Who are we putting on trial today? A liar, or a husband who lost everything and just wants to know why? The room fell silent. My eyes met Margaret's. She said nothing, just lifted her chin, lips tight, but her ringed hand clenched hard. The session adjourned. The judge scheduled a follow-up hearing within 30 days to reassess evidence. As people filed out, Ethan dropped into his seat, head hanging low. "They're choking us, Joseph," he said, voice rough. "They control the media, the court, everything. If Mike can't testify, we're done." I stayed quiet for a moment, then pulled an old photo from my coat pocket, the firehouse team. In the corner, beside Mike, was another man, Carl Jenkins, an electrical engineer once employed by Carter Construction. I remembered he'd been fired after the Eastwood blaze for breach of confidentiality. "You're right," I murmured. "Mike can't testify, but Carl might." Ethan looked up, eyes reigniting. "You know where he is?" "I heard he moved to Maine, living off the grid. If he's still alive, he's the only one who can confirm that falsified report Margaret signed." Ethan shot to his feet, grabbing his briefcase. "Then we find him. I don't care how far we have to drive." I glanced out the courthouse window. Snow was falling, soft and silent, covering the steps in white. Reporters still lingered outside, their lenses pointed at me, the man they called the crazy father. But deep down I knew, if we found Carl, everything would change. I took a deep breath, the cold air biting my lungs, and whispered like a vow. "Margaret Carter can buy the system, but she'll never buy the past." Ethan looked at me and smiled faintly. "And the past," he said, "is about to speak." We walked out of the courthouse and into the dim afternoon. A new chapter of the fight had begun, this time, not just in court, but out there, where the truth was still waiting to be found. A week after the first hearing, I thought everything would slip quietly back into silence. Then another explosion hit. Not from the courtroom this time, but from the media. That morning, as I was making coffee, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Sophie called, her voice shaking with excitement. "Turn on the TV now! Boston Independent News! Some independent journalist just dropped something no one's dared to show." I flipped on the television. On screen stood a young anchor in front of a digital board displaying the original 1995 Carter Construction Safety Inspection Report. Right under Margaret Carter's signature glowed a red line of text. Edited by Internal Office, 10/04/1995. The anchor said, "We've received a verified copy from a confidential source. The notation shows the document was altered after the fire, contradicting Mrs. Carter's sworn testimony in court last week." Social media detonated. Within hours, justice for Linda Taylor shot to the top of trending. Thousands of people reshared the story, posting collages of Linda and me, calling Margaret Carter the Queen of Lies. I never expected anyone to stand up for me, and certainly not for the truth to breathe again in that noisy world. The phone rang again. Ethan. "Good news, Joseph. That confidential source is Carl Jenkins. He sent the original to the reporter." "What?" "Carl's still in Maine. He's been terrified of retaliation, but after watching Carter deny everything on TV, he couldn't take it anymore. He sent the files to an independent journalist named Rachel Moore." I sank into my chair. After 30 years, someone had finally spoken. That afternoon, Rachel Moore uploaded a 12-minute video to her personal channel. It racked up over 5 million views in 24 hours. On screen, she stood straight, speaking clearly. "This isn't just a story about a fire. This is a story about greed, power, and a father being smeared for demanding justice for his wife." She rolled a short clip from Mike's recording, the same one the court refused to allow, with subtitles. Mike's frail voice trembled through the speakers. Carter Construction knew the electrical system wasn't up to code, but Margaret Carter said, "Just sign it. We can't afford a delay." The nation froze. Major newsrooms, once silent, came under pressure to respond. Some networks that had dodged the case began investigating again. A reporter from the Washington Herald commented, "If what's on this tape is real, this could be the biggest construction cover-up in Massachusetts history." Carter Holdings fired back hard. That same day, they held an emergency press conference. Margaret appeared pale but tried to look composed. "This tape is a forgery," she said. "The person behind it is being manipulated by economic adversaries." But this time, her words didn't soothe anyone. Public sentiment had shifted. People started looking at her with suspicion, while images of me, the quiet old man, spread online as a symbol of stubborn resolve. That night, I opened my email inbox to find hundreds of messages from strangers. "You've made me believe in justice again." "My dad died in another fire and no one ever stood up." "Thank you, Joseph." I sat there for a long time, reading line after line. In my small house, the only sounds were the rain outside and Linda's photo glowing in the warm lamplight. You see this, Linda? I whispered. People are starting to believe. The truth is waking up. Across the city, Margaret shattered a wineglass as she watched the news. She screamed at her assistant, "I want to know who leaked that file, and I want that tape gone from the internet. Now." But it was too late. Once the public catches the scent of the truth, no amount of power can smother it. The moment truth flickered, darkness surged back. 3 days after Rachel Moore's video hit 10 million views, Carter Holdings launched its counterattack. Not with arguments, with money, power, and the filth of underground media. That night, anonymous articles erupted across the internet. Joseph Taylor, a father with a history of alcoholism, once suspended for unstable behavior. Attorney Ethan Miles, secretly funded by Carter Holdings competitors. Journalist Sophie Allen rumored to have a personal relationship with a figure in the lawsuit. All baseless, but spreading at breakneck speed. Major outlets stayed silent, while small sites, gossip blogs, and YouTube channels milked the headlines. In the public's eyes, the truth blurred again. Comment sections split in two. One side called me a hero fighting a greedy corporation. The other labeled me an old man clinging to the past. I didn't respond. But Ethan couldn't take it. He stormed into my living room, clutching a newspaper. "They're saying I took money. All I've done is fight for justice, Joseph. How can they—" I set a hand on his shoulder. "Because you scare them," I said quietly. "You still believe in something they've long forgotten. The truth." Later, Sophie called, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "They're emailing me threats," she said, "telling me if I don't pull my articles, I'll vanish like the reporters who came before." "Did you call the police?" "I did. They said there's not enough evidence. Some calls never make it onto the record." Ethan picked her up that night. They holed up in a tiny apartment near the harbor. I stayed home alone, watching through the window as a black car idled on the street. Headlights flicking on, then off, on, off. A message without words. We're watching. That night I didn't sleep. I thought of Linda, of the smell of smoke and the crack of fire years ago. Back then I thought my enemy was the flames. Now I know the real enemy is the ones who light fires with money and hide their hands in the dark. By morning, Ethan was back, looking worn but eyes still burning. "We can't let them spin the story forever," he said. "I have a plan." "What plan?" "We're going to release Mike's full video, the uncut, unedited version. Sophie says she's got a copy on the old newsroom server. If we stream it live, they can't stop it." I hesitated. "You know what that means? They'll sue again. They'll come after you, Sophie." "They already have," he said with a bitter laugh. "There's only one path left, straight through." That evening, Sophie sent a text. "File's ready. But if I don't check in within 24 hours, give it to Rachel Moore." I read it, my heart heavy as stone. I knew she was risking not just her career, maybe her life. Meanwhile, Margaret Carter wasn't sitting still. She appeared on television again, voice calm but eyes flickering with fear. "I believe the law will protect the innocent," she said. "The truth cannot be distorted by emotion." But right after the interview, a backstage camera caught her slamming a stack of papers on the table, shouting at her aide, "I want that story off the internet. Triple the price if you have to. Just do it." The clip leaked online within hours. The internet exploded again. People shifted from doubt to outrage. The smear posts against me began disappearing, replaced by hashtags demanding a full investigation into the Eastwood fire. I stared at my screen, at one comment at the very bottom. "If he's telling the truth, this isn't just a fire, this is a 30-year confession." I smiled faintly, not because I'd won, but because for the first time I could see justice finding its way back. But I also knew Margaret's final blow hadn't come yet, and when she struck again, it wouldn't just be the media, it would be a real hunt. March 17th, 8 p.m. All across America, people were glued to their screens. Boston Independent News had just gone live with a special broadcast titled "The Fire That Never Died." The anchor began in a low, steady voice. "This is the original video testimony of former firefighter Michael Hudson, who passed away 2 weeks ago. In his final days, he recorded this confession about the Eastwood fire of 1995. The screen faded to black. Then came shaky footage, dim, grainy. Mike's raspy voice filled the air. "I know I'm dying, but I can't take this secret with me. We were ordered to sign off on the safety report even though the wiring failed inspection. Margaret Carter said, if anyone talks, they're digging their own grave. The studio fell silent. The anchor's voice trembled slightly as he continued. We've verified the video's authenticity with 3 independent forensic experts. No evidence of tampering. The internet exploded. The hashtag #JusticeForLinda overtook every political headline that day. Clips of the broadcast flooded social media, spliced with calls for a full investigation into Carter Holdings. Outside my house, the street filled with reporters, microphones shoved toward my face. Mr. Taylor, do you feel vindicated now? Do you have a message for Mrs. Carter? I only said one thing. It's not me who's vindicated. It's Linda. Ethan and Sophie arrived soon after, both exhausted, running on no sleep. Joseph, you did it, Sophie said, her eyes rimmed red. The whole country's on your side. The state just reopened the Eastwood investigation. I stood frozen, heart pounding. After 30 years, justice might finally return. But that joy lasted only 12 hours. The next morning, as I stepped outside, 2 police cruisers pulled up. A sergeant unfolded a document and read aloud, voice cold as steel. Joseph Taylor, you're under arrest for alleged bribery and falsification of the 1995 Eastwood Incident Report. I stared at him, stunned. What? We have evidence, he said flatly. A 1995 bank record shows you received $50,000 from Carter Construction 2 weeks before the fire. My stomach dropped. I'd never seen a cent of that money. Ethan ran up, grabbed the papers, scanned them. His face went pale. My God, this is fake. The bank seal doesn't even match. They don't care, I whispered, voice breaking. They just need a reason to shut me up. Cameras flashed as officers cuffed my wrists. The crowd shouted, "So he was involved!" What a fraud! They shoved me into the car. Through the glass I saw Sophie crying, Ethan shouting after me, "I won't let them do this. I'll prove you're innocent!" The holding cell smelled of rust and damp concrete. I closed my eyes. Linda's voice echoed in my head, words she'd said years ago. Joseph, if you live for the truth, never fear the dark. I whispered back, I'm not afraid, Linda, but this time, they don't just want to kill justice. They want to erase your memory. Outside, the headlines screamed, Joseph Taylor arrested, hero or hoax. Half the country raged in disbelief. The other half doubted everything. Then Margaret Carter appeared on television again, her voice soft, her eyes glistening as if she, too, were a victim. I take no pleasure in seeing an elderly man behind bars, she said calmly, but the law must be respected. In the darkness of my cell, I laughed, dry, bitter. She had just turned me into the villain, and herself into the hero. That night, Ethan filed an emergency appeal. Sophie went live, her voice shaking but defiant. This is the last desperate act of the powerful. They can lock Joseph away, but they can't lock away the truth. And she was right. Outside the detention center, hundreds of people gathered, holding candles, chanting Linda's and my name. The glow of those tiny flames reflected off the prison walls like fire, but this time, it wasn't destruction, it was belief. And no one could put it out again. The morning of the trial, Boston lay under cold rain and the flashing glare of hundreds of TV cameras. The whole country was holding its breath. Outside the federal courthouse, crowds stretched for blocks. 2 divided camps shouting across the barricades. One side waved banners reading Justice for Joseph. The other held signs that said, No one is above the law. I was escorted through a side entrance. The heavy metal door clanged shut behind me. Even without handcuffs, I felt shackled. Not by steel, but by 30 years of sorrow. Inside my thin coat, I shivered. Not from fear, from the weight of everything I'd lost. Ethan was waiting in the hallway, clutching a thick folder of documents. His face was drawn, tired, but his eyes still burned with purpose. When he saw me, he whispered, Don't worry, Joseph. Today, we end 30 years of lies. I nodded, and we stepped into the courtroom. The gallery was packed. In the front row sat Margaret Carter, poised, elegant as ever, flanked by 2 of her attorneys. But I caught it, a faint tremor at the corner of her mouth. Even she was afraid. The judge struck the gavel. The sound cracked through the chamber like thunder. This court convenes to hear the case of the state versus Joseph Taylor, charged with bribery and falsifying the Eastwood fire report of 1995. The prosecution went first. Their lead attorney spoke with slick precision. Your Honor, the evidence shows that Mr. Taylor accepted $50,000 from Carter Construction just 2 weeks before the Eastwood tragedy. He was in a position to alter the official investigation report, and we believe he did, to conceal corporate negligence. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. I kept my head bowed. Ethan stood. That document is a forgery, he said sharply. We filed a request for verification with the issuing bank. Their official reply confirms they never produced any such statement. Moreover, my client, Joseph Taylor, never held any authority to edit investigation reports in the first place. The judge frowned, turning to the prosecution. Do you have confirmation from the bank? We're awaiting the comparative records, the lawyer replied. Ethan let out a thin, icy smile. So as of now, you have nothing but a fake piece of paper. The crowd stirred. Whispers swelled. The judge banged the gavel again for order. Across the aisle, Margaret sat motionless, but her ringed fingers tapped lightly on her thigh, like a signal. One of her lawyers leaned in to whisper something to the prosecutors. I knew what that meant. They were shifting tactics. Ethan opened his case file and took out a USB drive. Your Honor, the defense presents new evidence. An audio statement from witness Carl Jenkins, a former electrical engineer at Carter Construction, terminated in 1995 for breach of confidentiality. Mr. Jenkins testifies that Margaret Carter herself ordered falsified safety reports and paid hush money to involved employees. The prosecution erupted. Objection. This evidence is inadmissible, the source is absent, and the recording's authenticity is unverified. Ethan met their outrage with calm fire. Mr. Jenkins is currently under protection through the main witness security program. He has agreed to appear live via video conference to verify his statement. Gasps spread through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward. If the witness can confirm his identity, the court will allow the video testimony. Margaret spun toward her lawyer, whispering frantically. For the first time, panic flickered across her polished face. The courtroom lights dimmed. The large screen lit up. Static. Then the image steadied. A man with silver hair appeared, his eyes weary but clear. A police officer stood behind him. My name is Carl Jenkins, he began, voice trembling. I worked as an electrical engineer for Carter Construction. In March 1995, I warned management that the Eastwood building's wiring failed safety standards. It could explode if not replaced. Mrs. Carter told me to stay quiet. 3 days later, I was fired. 2 weeks later, the fire happened. I kept a copy of the original inspection file, signed by her. A stunned silence fell. Ethan spoke again, voice steady but fierce. Your Honor, the witness also provided internal emails in which Mrs. Carter instructed her accounting department to transfer $50,000 to PR Fund, code JT, the same account used in the forged statement accusing Mr. Taylor. The judge turned to the prosecution. Do you have any explanation for this? Nothing. The attorneys sat stone still. Margaret's face had gone pale, her composure cracking. Ethan closed his folder, his voice tightening with emotion. For 30 years, this man has lived under suspicion, carrying the weight of his wife's death while the truth was buried. Today, the truth finally speaks for itself. Joseph Taylor never took a bribe. He only took back his right to justice. The courtroom erupted in applause. The judge struck the gavel for silence, but some couldn't hold back tears. Across the aisle, Margaret bowed her head, lips pressed white, and in the back row I saw him, Daniel, my son, burying his face in his hands. In that moment, I understood. The final battle had begun. No longer father versus son, no longer the living against the dead. This was justice versus power, at last, in front of the world. The court recessed for 15 minutes, but the air inside was still thick enough to cut with a knife. Outside in the hallway, reporters jostled for space, cameras flashing like a storm of hungry eyes waiting for the next fall of the powerful. In a private room, Margaret Carter sat surrounded by 3 of her lawyers. Her hair was tangled, makeup streaked with sweat. One of the attorneys leaned in and whispered, "We still have time. If Jenkins withdraws his testimony, or is declared unreliable, the video becomes void." Margaret's eyes flashed. "What did you say?" "I mean, there are ways to make him change his mind. Our people in Maine still have influence." She was silent for a moment, then said quietly, voice sharp as a blade, "Do it." That afternoon, the session resumed. Ethan and I returned to our seats. The screen flickered to life, showing Carl Jenkins preparing for cross-examination. Then, without warning, the video signal broke. Static, silence, gone. Gasps swept through the room. Technicians scrambled to reconnect. The judge frowned. "What's happening?" A clerk hurried in, handing him a note. "Your Honor, police in Maine just reported that witness Carl Jenkins was found unconscious in his car. He's being rushed to the hospital." The courtroom froze. Ethan's fists clenched. I heard the grind of my own teeth. "No, they got to him," he whispered. The prosecution rose almost instantly, seizing the moment. "Your Honor, with the witness incapacitated, the defense's video evidence can no longer be verified. We move to strike it from the record." Ethan exploded to his feet. "He's not dead. He was attacked for speaking the truth, and you all know it." Chaos broke out, voices shouting, chairs scraping. The judge hammered the gavel again and again, but order was gone. Across the aisle, Margaret sat perfectly still, eyes like ice. Then she looked at me, and in that instant she smiled. A small, knowing smile, the kind of smile that cuts deeper than any knife. And then the courtroom doors burst open. Footsteps echoed through the chaos. A man stepped in, rain-soaked shirt clinging to his shoulders, eyes red with tears. Daniel. He stopped halfway down the aisle, breathing hard. Everyone turned. I have something to say," he stammered. The judge narrowed his eyes. "And you are?" "I'm Daniel Taylor," he said hoarsely. "The defendant's son, and the fiancé of Emily Carter." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Daniel walked to the front, trembling but resolute. "I know I'm not supposed to speak here, but I have to. I found something on Emily's computer." He held up a small USB drive, his hand shaking. "It's an email exchange between Emily and her mother, sent 2 days ago. In it, Mrs. Carter orders the plan to neutralize the witness Carl Jenkins by any means necessary. I verified it myself. It's real." The courtroom erupted. Margaret shot to her feet. "That's a lie." "You've been manipulated, Daniel." He turned to her, his voice breaking. "I was manipulated my whole life. You told me my father was crazy, that he made it all up to destroy our family. But it was you, Mom. You destroyed it. You stole my mother from me, and you stole my conscience along with her." His words hung heavy in the air. Tears rolled down his face, and from others in the room as well. Margaret's face drained of color. She tried to steady her voice. "I did what I had to do, to protect my daughter from a dangerous man." "Dangerous?" Daniel shouted. "The only dangerous person here is you. You let people die for your reputation. You killed their memory to keep your name clean." Ethan moved quickly. "Your Honor, the defense requests that the USB be submitted for verification." A technician stepped forward, plugged it in. The courtroom lights dimmed as the screen flickered on. There it was. An email, time-stamped, signed, "Carl Jenkins is a threat. Handle him before he talks. Do not let this reach the media. MC." The words hit like a blade through glass. Gasps. Silence. The judge looked down, his tone heavy. "Mrs. Carter, do you have an explanation for this?" Margaret sat frozen. Her lips quivered, hands trembling. The mask was gone. No more elegance, no more control. Just a woman collapsing under the weight of her own lies. Daniel turned to me, tears glistening in his eyes. "Dad, I'm sorry." I said nothing. I simply walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. And in that moment I knew, no matter what came next, I had my son back. The judge called for an adjournment to verify the email's source. But everyone in that courtroom already knew. The scales of justice had shifted. In the back row, Sophie wept openly. Ethan sat down, his hands trembling. And for the first time in decades, I looked up, through the blinding white light that poured down from the ceiling, and felt it on my face. 30 years. And finally, light was cutting through the smoke. The next morning, as the court prepared to reconvene, the entire city felt frozen in suspense. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of people stood in the cold rain, candles flickering in their hands. They had kept vigil all night. The morning headlines screamed across every front page. Carter Holdings' internal emails leaked. Will justice finally be served? Inside the courtroom, I sat quietly, hands trembling. Daniel sat beside me, no longer the distant, hardened man I'd known these past months, but a son, eyes full of remorse. Ethan handed me his phone. On the screen glowed a new message. Carl Jenkins is awake. He's asking to testify. In person. I squeezed Ethan's hand, a tired but hopeful smile crossing my face. Then this is it, son. This is the end. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. Across the aisle, Margaret Carter appeared. No makeup, no jewelry, no armor left. Her hair hung limp, her complexion pale. The pride and polish that once defined her had cracked away, leaving only exhaustion. The judge spoke firmly. This court has received a formal request for live testimony from Mr. Carl Jenkins, a direct witness to the 1995 Eastwood fire. The request is granted. The doors opened. Carl Jenkins was wheeled in, frail but conscious, his eyes sharp beneath the hospital pallor. He took the microphone, his voice rough but resolute. I'm sorry I stayed silent for so long, he began. His words trembled but struck like nails in the air. I confirm that I witnessed Mrs. Margaret Carter ordering the Eastwood site inspection to be passed despite failing electrical safety tests. I kept the original report, and this... He lifted a sealed envelope with shaking hands. An officer brought it to the front. Ethan opened it carefully and laid the contents before the judge. Inside was the original safety inspection report, the words, "Failed to meet operational standards," underlined in red, and beneath it, the unmistakable signature, Margaret Carter, approved. The room erupted. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, people gasped and wept all at once. The judge struck the gavel for order, then turned to Margaret, his tone heavy. "Mrs. Carter, do you deny that this is your signature?" Margaret rose unsteadily. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Then, in a whisper almost broken, "Yes, it's mine. But I never thought it would end in death." Her voice cracked. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the once untouchable titan of industry crumbled. In that moment, she was no longer the queen of Boston's corporate world, just a woman staring into the ruins of her own making. Ethan stood, his voice thick but strong. "Your Honor, my client has been defamed, framed, and shamed for 30 years. A man who lost his wife, his family, his dignity, all because he refused to lie. Today, we ask that he finally receive the 2 words he has long deserved: not guilty." The judge lifted the gavel. 3 hard strikes echoed through the chamber. After reviewing all evidence presented, this court finds the defendant, Joseph Taylor, not guilty on all charges. Furthermore, Mrs. Margaret Carter and Carter Holdings will be indicted on counts of document fraud, bribery, and obstruction of justice, sentencing to follow. For a second, silence. Then, thunderous applause. The crowd surged to its feet. Ethan pulled me into an embrace, tears falling onto my shoulder. Sophie was crying openly in the gallery, and Daniel, my son, fell to his knees before me, sobbing. "I'm sorry, Dad, I was blind for so long." I placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "No, Daniel, you just lost your way. What matters is, you found it again." Across the aisle, Margaret collapsed into her seat. Her daughter Emily ran to her, weeping. Margaret looked up weakly, whispering, "I only wanted to protect you from the truth." Emily's voice broke. "And instead you made me stop believing in it." Flashes burst across the room as police approached. When they cuffed Margaret Carter, she looked at me one last time. There was no hatred left in her eyes, only the hollow fatigue of someone who had finally lost to herself. Outside, the rain had stopped. As I stepped through the courthouse doors, the crowd erupted into cheers. Rows of candles lit the street like a sea of tiny fires. A little girl stepped forward, holding out a white rose. "For your wife," she said softly. "For Linda." I took it, staring up at the sky. The clouds were breaking apart, and for the first time in years, I saw the faint shimmer of dawn. Ethan came beside me, his voice low, almost reverent. Justice came late, but it came. I nodded, smiling through the tears. No one can burn the truth forever, Ethan. Fire can destroy everything, except memory. And as the first light of morning spilled across the courthouse steps, I knew the 30-year battle was finally over. Linda could rest, and for the first time in a lifetime, I could breathe as a free man. 3 months after the trial, Boston's spring arrived late. Snow still blanketed the courthouse steps, though the first cherry blossoms had begun to bloom outside the gates of the Massachusetts Correctional Facility. Inside, Margaret Carter sat silently on a metal cot. Her gray prison uniform had faded. Her hair, once perfectly colored and styled, now streaked with silver and ash. She had once been the woman who made a city bow, powerful, elegant, untouchable. Now she was just a shadow of herself. In the corner, a small TV flickered with the morning news. The anchor's voice was flat, detached. Carter Holdings has officially declared bankruptcy. The board of directors has disbanded. The company's stock has been removed from trading. Hundreds of employees have lost their jobs. A class action lawsuit has been filed by investors seeking $2.3 billion in damages. Margaret reached over and turned the TV off. Her hands, the same hands that once wore diamonds and signed billion-dollar deals, trembled, veins and scars showing through her pale skin. She could still hear the roar of applause from the courtroom that day. And Daniel's eyes, that look of fury and pity intertwined, haunted her. It was that look that kept her awake for weeks after the verdict. The guard came by with the morning mail. She didn't have to check the envelope to know who it was from. Emily. Her daughter still visited every week, always leaving in tears. Margaret unfolded the letter. The handwriting was soft, wavering. Mom, I still can't get used to seeing you behind bars, but I understand now why things had to end this way. You always told me, never let anyone else define who you are. Now I'm learning to define myself, not as Margaret Carter's daughter, but as just Emily. I only hope one day you can forgive yourself. Margaret's fingers tightened around the paper. Tears slid down her cheeks. Forgive yourself. It was something she'd never truly understood. Not in 20 years of power, not even in defeat. In her mind, she still heard Linda Taylor's voice, a voice she had never known, yet somehow could never escape. One signature, one act of silence, and a life burned away because of it. Outside, Daniel lived alone in a small apartment on the north side of the city. He had sold the big house, split the assets with Emily, and left his old job. After the fall of Carter Holdings, his world had collapsed too. Business partners gone, friends avoiding him, colleagues pretending not to know his name. Each morning he brewed coffee and sat by the window for hours, staring at the street below. Every time a fire truck wailed past, he froze. That sound, sharp, relentless, reminded him of the inferno his father once fought, and of the flames that never truly die inside those left behind. One afternoon, Emily came to visit. She looked thinner, her face drawn, but her eyes were softer now. Daniel, she said quietly, I'm leaving the city. I need to start over somewhere new, not to run away, but to live again. He nodded. I understand. Will you ever forgive my mother? She asked. He gave a weary smile. I don't know. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's just learning to stop letting hate eat you alive. Maybe someday. They fell silent. Outside, the snow had begun to melt. Droplets slid down the window frame, glimmering like tears from the city itself. That evening, the news broke. Carter Holdings was officially erased from the National Corporate Registry. The 45-story headquarters, once a monument to wealth and ambition, had been sealed off, awaiting auction. The massive Carter letters were torn from the facade, crashing to the ground in pieces, fragments of a fallen empire. Ethan sent me a photo of the building, its empty windows staring like hollow eyes. He called soon after. They burned themselves down, he said softly. No, I answered. Fire only goes where there's rot to feed it. What burned today began with what they buried years ago. Justice just brought it back to light. Somewhere Margaret was hearing that same report, maybe even looking at those same ruins in her mind. And she knew everything she had built on lies had turned to ash, just like the fire in 1995 that had taken Linda, and in its own way, her own soul. Nights inside prison were longer than anywhere else. There were no clocks, only the slow, hollow drip of water from an old pipe echoing against the concrete floor like the ticking of a guilty conscience. Margaret Carter lay awake on her narrow steel bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Every time she drifted off, she found herself back in a burning hallway, flames roaring on both sides, smoke swallowing everything. And through the haze, a woman's voice called her name. Margaret, why did you sign it? She jolted upright, soaked in sweat. The guard light spilling through the bars shimmered like falling ash. The dream came every night, and every morning she woke with the same feeling, as if she'd just escaped a fire, only to find no one left to save her, In prison, she rarely spoke. Some inmates recognized her name. One of them muttered, "That's the woman who used to own half the city." Another answered coldly, "If you build your fortune on someone's blood, you'll pay for it eventually." Margaret said nothing. Each word hit her like a knife, but she didn't flinch. Maybe this was her only way to atone, to endure it, one day at a time. One Monday morning, the prison chaplain stopped by her cell. He set a worn Bible on the table and said softly, "No one redeems themselves with money, Mrs. Carter, but the truth can still redeem a soul, if you're willing to speak it." She looked up, eyes clouded. "I spoke too late." "No," he said. "God doesn't measure time in years, only in the moments when we finally face our sins." That sentence followed her all afternoon. For the first time in years, she whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for the strength to bear what she had done. Out in the world, Joseph Taylor had become something unexpected, a symbol of steadfastness and integrity. After the trial, universities, civic groups, even the Boston Fire Department invited him to speak. He declined most offers, accepting only a few small gatherings, places where young people came to learn about ethics and truth. At his first talk, he wore a simple suit and stepped onto the stage. The light caught the deep lines on his face, but his voice was steady and warm. "I'm not here to tell you about bad people," he began. "I'm here to tell you about good people who stay silent. The truth doesn't die because of liars. It dies because those who know it choose to say nothing." The audience was silent. Some wiped their eyes. At the end, a young student approached him and asked quietly, "Sir, if you could go back, would you do it all differently?" Joseph smiled. "No, I'd still speak up, even if it took another 30 years to be believed. Because if I'd stayed silent, Linda would have died twice." It was the first time he had said her name without his voice breaking. When he stepped out into the hallway afterward, he saw Daniel waiting by the door. Their eyes met, hesitant but peaceful. Daniel had begun his own redemption. He volunteered with a local housing program, rebuilding old homes for low-income families, the same neighborhoods he once looked down on. His hands were blistered, his clothes covered in dust, but he said quietly one evening, "For the first time, Dad, I feel lighter." As they sat together under the porch at dusk, Joseph asked, "Have you seen Emily's mother lately?" "Yes," Daniel said. "She's thinner now. Emily told me. She started praying every night." Joseph nodded slowly. "Sometimes the real punishment isn't a sentence. It's the memory." Daniel lowered his head. "I wasted so many years learning that." "It's all right," Joseph said, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "What matters is that you're living like a man now. Mistakes can be fixed, as long as you don't turn your back on your conscience." For a moment they just looked at each other, no more words needed. Around them, hammers echoed across the construction site, soft, rhythmic strikes, like the heartbeat of something being rebuilt from ashes. That night, back in her cell, Margaret dreamed again. But this time, the smoke was thinner. She saw Linda Taylor standing in the fire, not angry anymore, just smiling. "Thank you," Linda said gently, "for finally stopping." When Margaret awoke, dawn was breaking. A sliver of sunlight fell through the bars, touching the floor, faint, fragile, but beautiful. And for the first time she understood. This was the only piece of freedom she had left, and perhaps the only piece she truly deserved. 3 years passed after the verdict. That winter in Boston was unusually harsh, the kind that freezes breath mid-air. Snow buried the prison yard under a white silence, and the wind moaned through the bars like the whispers of the past. In cell 212, Margaret Carter sat by the window, a thin blanket draped over her knees. No one called her Mrs. Carter anymore. There were no assistants, no clicking heels in the hallway, no motorcade waiting outside. She was just another number, another inmate living off memories and remorse. Her health had begun to fade. Heart trouble and depression confined her to the infirmary wing. The nurses said she still read her letters every morning, the only ones she received from Emily and Daniel. One morning, a young nurse asked softly, "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret looked up, gave a faint, brittle smile. "No one lives long enough to fix everything they've broken, but at least I've seen a glimmer of light before the dark closes in." She asked for a sheet of paper and wrote her final letter, to Daniel and to Joseph. The handwriting was shaky, fading in places, but every word carried weight. Joseph, I don't have much time. Every night I still see Linda standing among the ruins, calling your name. I once believed everything I did was for my family, but it was only to protect my pride. Daniel, my son, lived differently than I did. Don't build your life on fear. If you can, tell Linda. I'm sorry. Margaret. 2 weeks later, she died in her sleep, quiet as a candle burning out. No one in the prison cried, but when the news hit the city, Boston fell silent for an afternoon. There was no grand funeral, no cameras, no flowers. Only Emily, her daughter, left a small bouquet of white lilies on the grave before walking away alone. Across town, Joseph and Daniel stood inside a renovated firehouse, Station 42, once the pride of Boston's first responders. Behind them hung a banner that read, "The Linda Taylor Foundation, the fire that never dies." The foundation had been created to help survivors of house fires, offering housing, trauma counseling, and scholarships for children of fallen firefighters. Daniel served as the executive director, Joseph as honorary advisor. They weren't wealthy, and there were no corporate sponsors, but every donation came with a handwritten note, a story, a belief that justice wasn't a luxury. During the opening ceremony, Joseph stepped to the podium. His voice, worn and gravelly, carried the weight of time, but also its peace. 30 years ago, he began, I lost the woman I loved most to a fire. It took me another 30 to realize the fire wasn't just in the ashes, it was in us. It burns when good people stay silent. Today, I don't want anyone else to lose someone they love because of fear. The audience rose in applause. Daniel watched his father, pride glistening in his eyes. He was no longer the son running from his past. He was the man rebuilding it, piece by piece. After the ceremony, when the crowd had gone, Joseph stepped outside. Dusk had fallen, snow drifted softly, silver in the streetlights. Daniel brought him a small bronze plaque. The first light of the Linda Foundation, kindled from the heart. Together they fixed it above the doorway. The light flickered once, then steadied, glowing against the snow, reflecting off their faces, one old, one young. Dad, Daniel whispered, I think Mom would be proud. Joseph smiled. Not just your mother, son, all the ones who never got to be remembered. He looked out toward the horizon. In the night, that little light glowed through the glass, like Linda's flame, still burning. Not wild, not consuming, but steady, guiding. The next morning, the papers ran a photograph of the two men standing beside the sign. The caption read, From the ashes of tragedy, they chose to rebuild the light. Ethan read the article at their old cafe, the one where everything began, and smiled quietly to himself. Sophie wrote a long editorial that evening. Justice may come late, but when it arrives, it brings not only truth, but awakening, because memory can never truly be buried. And in the quiet cemetery south of Boston, the wind still moved through rows of bare trees. Two graves lay side by side, Linda Taylor and Margaret Carter. No one knew who had placed them together, perhaps fate's way of closing the circle, a victim and her destroyer resting in the same earth. Joseph often visited, carrying a white rose and a small candle. He would light it, kneel between their names, and whisper, Linda, you see, your fire saved more lives than I ever could. Then he would smile faintly, watching the candle flicker in the wind, not as a farewell, but as a promise. A promise that her light, and the truth she died for, would never go out again. Spring nights in Boston were unusually quiet that year. In Joseph's small house, the living room light still burned late into the night. He sat by the window, a cold cup of tea before him, eyes fixed on the fading snow outside. The last of winter melted slowly, leaving silver streaks of water beneath the moonlight. Since Margaret's death, he hadn't visited the cemetery again, not because of anger, but because he no longer knew what to say standing before her grave. A part of him still believed that if Linda were alive, she would have forgiven Margaret. Forgiveness, Linda used to say, is the only way to put out the fire inside us. But Joseph still hadn't found that peace. That night he drifted off on the sofa. In his half-sleep he heard a knock at the door. Once, twice, 3 times. He rose and opened it. And there she was, Margaret Carter. Not in her prison uniform, but in the white coat she used to wear in the 1990s, her hair neatly pinned, her face softened by something almost human again. Her eyes were deep, endless. "Joseph," she said, voice gentle as wind, "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness. I came to tell you, I've seen Linda." Joseph froze. He didn't know whether to fear or believe what stood before him, but something in her tone, fragile, remorseful, held him still. "You saw her?" he whispered. "Yes," Margaret said. "She wasn't angry. She only asked me, 'Margaret, did you ever find peace?' And I couldn't answer." She stepped inside, the moonlight filtering through her almost transparent form, a shimmer, like smoke dissolving in air. "I thought death would be the end," she continued, "but it's not. Every night I see the fire, not around me, but inside me. It burns with memory." "Maybe because you never told the whole truth," Joseph said quietly. Margaret nodded. "Yes. There's something I never confessed, something I owed you and Linda both. I kept a letter she wrote to the company before the fire, a warning about the faulty wiring. If I'd read it, if I'd cared enough to read it, everything might have been different." Joseph felt the room close in. In his mind, he could see Linda again, her small frame, her determined eyes, holding the letter no one had bothered to read. "I'll leave it for you," Margaret said, "as my last testimony." "But you're dead," he murmured. She gave a faint smile. "Remorse doesn't die, Joseph. It just changes form." And then she turned, slowly fading into the moonlight, until there was nothing left but silence. Joseph woke with a start. On the table beside Linda's photograph lay a yellowed envelope. His heart pounded. He reached for it. Inside was a letter, the paper aged but real. "The electrical system on the third floor needs immediate inspection. If not, an accident could occur at any time." Linda Taylor, March 12, 1995. Her handwriting, her signature, the date. Everything was exactly as Margaret had said. Joseph sank into the chair, his hands trembling. Margaret hadn't returned for forgiveness. She'd come back to finish the justice she herself had destroyed. Outside, wind rattled the window panes, and in the dim light, Joseph thought he saw two faint silhouettes, Linda and Margaret, standing side by side in the snowlight, silent, no longer divided by hatred, sharing the same memory at last. The next morning, Daniel came to visit. Joseph told him about the dream and showed him the letter. Daniel touched the paper carefully, eyes filled with awe and sorrow. "I used to think Emily's mother was a monster," he said softly, "but maybe the cruelest punishment is living long enough to feel the weight of your own guilt." Joseph nodded. "The worst sentence," he said, "is knowing you were wrong and realizing you can never undo it." They sat in silence for a long time. Then Daniel murmured, "If she really came back, maybe she was trying to make things right, in her own way." Joseph smiled faintly. "Maybe. The dead only return when the living haven't forgiven them yet. It means she still believes there's a door open somewhere." That afternoon, father and son brought Linda's letter to the Linda Taylor Foundation. They placed it inside a glass case beside her photograph. A small plaque beneath it read, "The letter no one listened to saved thousands after her. Truth can be forgotten, but never lost." As they stepped back, the light of the setting sun caught the glass, refracting into soft golden hues. And for a brief, breathless moment, Joseph thought he saw Margaret again. Not the fallen woman from prison, but a quiet soul smiling from behind the glass, eyes at peace at last. The fire within her, it seemed, had finally gone out. Boston slept under a quiet sky. Snowflakes drifted down like slow-falling memories, dissolving before they touched the ground. In his small apartment, Daniel worked late, the amber glow of his desk lamp spilling over piles of case files from the Linda Taylor Foundation. He read each letter from survivors of fires, families who had lost everything yet somehow still wrote with hope. Every word carried a story, a wound, and a flicker of faith. A cold wind slipped through the window frame. Daniel looked up just as the photo of Emily's mother on his desk tilted and fell to the floor. He bent to pick it up, and for an instant the faint scent of jasmine filled the air, a scent he hadn't smelled since the day Margaret Carter died. Then came a voice, soft, distant, like wind whispering through glass. "Daniel." He froze. At the window stood Margaret, not the hardened woman of power, but a mother. Her face was calm, her eyes full of sorrow, her hands bare. "Mother," Daniel whispered. "Are you? Don't be afraid," she said gently. "I didn't come to hurt you. I came to say thank you." The lamplight shimmered through her faint form, giving her the glow of mist and memory. "Thank you," she said, "for not hating me forever. I once believed power could make me respected, but in that cell I learned power means nothing without honesty." Daniel's throat tightened. "I don't hate you anymore, Mom. I just wish you'd told the truth sooner." Margaret's eyes softened, glimmering like tears that couldn't fall. "So do I. But sometimes people only find their way home when they've gone too far to turn back. Don't be like me, Daniel. Never let pride matter more than conscience." A gust of wind swept through the room, stirring the curtains. When he looked up, she was gone. Only the scent of jasmine lingered. Daniel sat down slowly, eyes burning, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. That night, for the first time, he slept without nightmares. No fire, no shouting, no guilt. Just a whisper in the dark. "I'm proud of you." Across the city, Emily dreamed too. She was back in the garden behind her childhood home, bathed not in sunlight, but in silver moonlight. There, among the quiet trees, stood her mother. Margaret's hair moved softly in the wind, her face calm, free of the pain that had haunted her in life. "Mom," Emily cried, running toward her. "I miss you. I miss you too, sweetheart." They embraced and warmth bloomed, not the warmth of flesh, but of forgiveness. "Live for me," Margaret whispered. "Be kind, be brave, never bow to deceit. I sinned because I thought I was protecting you by hiding the truth. But truth, Emily, truth is the only thing that can ever save us." Emily nodded, tears falling onto her mother's shoulder. Margaret smiled faintly, her hands beginning to fade into light. "Don't cry. I'm not afraid anymore. Where I am, Linda has forgiven me." She said, "We're both mothers. No mother wants her child to live in darkness." The light around her grew brighter, until it filled the garden completely. Emily woke with tears on her cheeks. Outside, the snow had stopped and dawn was breaking. Her mother was gone, but this time she was at peace. That morning, at the Linda Taylor Foundation, Joseph received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a letter, written in fragile, trembling handwriting he recognized immediately: Margaret Carter. He opened it carefully and read, "Joseph, if you're reading this, I've already gone. I won't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I only want to thank you. Because of you, I finally understood. Justice isn't revenge. It's the chance to face oneself. Thank you for keeping Linda alive in people's hearts." When I met her, she told me, "If Joseph keeps hating me, my soul will never rest. So if you can, let both of us rest now. Margaret." Joseph read the letter slowly, then sat in silence. Outside, the morning light spilled through the window, touching the framed photograph of Linda on his desk. He placed Margaret's letter beside it and smiled softly. "I forgive her, Linda," he whispered, "because without her remorse, I'd have never known how powerful forgiveness really is." A warm draft stirred the curtains. Sunlight shimmered across the photograph, and for a moment Linda seemed to smile. Joseph lit a small candle beside the frame. The flame flickered gently, golden and alive, and in its glow he thought he saw two silhouettes, Linda and Margaret, standing side by side, smiling before stepping together into the distant light. No cries, no anger, only the quiet radiance of peace, the kind of justice that doesn't punish, but redeems. 10 years had passed since the case closed, and Boston had changed. The city felt calmer now, new towers gleaming under neon lights, the night sky washed clean of the smoke that once darkened it. But for Joseph Taylor, everything had only just begun. At 75, he still woke at 5 every morning, brewed himself a cup of black tea, and walked to the modest office of the Linda Foundation, the charity that bore his late wife's name. Each morning he'd stroll down the narrow hallway where photographs lined the walls, smiling families, children clutching teddy bears, handwritten notes that read, "Thank you to the man who keeps the fire." That was what people called him now, the firekeeper. Not because he'd once fought real flames, but because he'd kept alive the fire of honesty and compassion, no matter how fiercely the winds of life tried to extinguish it. Every week he visited hospitals, low-income neighborhoods, and shelters for fire victims. He never spoke about the trial anymore. Instead, he told people that everyone, no matter how lost, could still be saved if they had the courage to face their own reflection. One afternoon, during a QA with a group of engineering students, a young woman raised her hand. "Sir," she asked, "what was the hardest thing you ever had to do?" Joseph smiled, his eyes kind behind his glasses. "The hardest thing?" he repeated softly. "It wasn't pulling people out of a burning building. It was learning how to forgive others, and myself. Because if you keep the fire of hatred inside you, it'll burn your soul long before it burns anyone else." The room went silent. In the front row, a student lowered his head, his fists clenched. After the talk, he approached Joseph privately and confessed that he had once taken a bribe to ignore a safety inspection. Joseph simply placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You spoke up. That means you've already started saving yourself." Those words became the Foundation's motto. A plaque at the entrance now read, "Truth doesn't make us weak. Truth makes us free." From a single man's tragedy, Joseph's journey had become a message shared by thousands. Schools invited him to lecture on ethics. TV networks wanted documentaries about the Eastwood fire. He declined them all. "I don't need people to remember my name," he told a journalist once. "Just remember Linda, and what she believed, that even a small warning letter can save a city if someone takes the time to read it." Most afternoons, Joseph would sit by the window of his office, watching children play in the park across the street. When the wind passed through the trees, he sometimes thought he heard a whisper, soft, tender, "You've done well, Joseph." And he knew it was Linda, the woman who had taught him that justice was never about winning or losing, but about holding on to kindness, even when the world turns away. 15 years after the trial, the Linda Foundation was no longer just a small neighborhood charity in Boston. It had grown into a national relief network, active in more than 20 states, wherever fires, disasters, or loss needed a human hand to help rebuild. Joseph, now elderly, remained the soul of the organization. Daniel, seasoned by time and humility, served as executive director, leading hundreds of young volunteers who called him the son of the firekeeper. Together they launched programs like Homes After the Flame, rebuilding houses for families who had lost everything. They created a scholarship fund in the name of Margaret Carter for engineering students committed to upholding the highest safety standards, a living reminder of the lesson written in tragedy. At first, many protested the idea of naming a scholarship after the woman responsible for so much pain, but Joseph only smiled and said, "A name can't erase a sin, but it can remind us never to repeat it." Under their guidance, the foundation became a symbol of renewal. Years later, the city of Boston honored Joseph at a ceremony commemorating its firefighting service, calling him the Keeper of Light, the man who turned private grief into a torch for others. That night, Daniel gave a short, trembling speech. "When I was young, I was ashamed of my father. Today, I'm proud to call myself his son." The hall erupted in applause, but Joseph only bowed his head, eyes glistening. One autumn afternoon, as wind carried the scent of dry leaves through the window, Joseph received a thick, carefully sealed envelope. The sender's mark read, "Carter Family Legal Trust, New York." He hesitated before opening it. Neither he nor Daniel knew anyone still representing the Carter family. Emily had left the country years ago. Inside was a handwritten letter and a check. "Dear Mr. Joseph Taylor, my name is Grace Carter, granddaughter of Margaret. I grew up overseas, knowing little of the events that marked our family's past. Last year, while reading my grandmother's journals, I learned the truth, and of what you did to restore it. I write on behalf of the Carter family to say only one word: thank you. My grandmother didn't live to see what you built, but I believe if she could, she would smile. Please accept this small donation, $500,000, to support the Linda Foundation. And if you allow, we would like to name your next project The Light of Both, in memory of Linda Taylor and Margaret Carter. Sincerely, Grace Carter." Joseph read each line slowly, his hands trembling. He didn't glance at the number on the check. His eyes lingered instead on those final words. The light of both. Linda, the woman who had perished in the fire. Margaret, the woman consumed by her own guilt. And now they were remembered together, not as victim and villain, but as two lights that in their own ways had shaped redemption. Daniel stood beside him, voice low. Maybe this is how their family says sorry. Joseph smiled faintly. No, son, not an apology, a continuation. She's gone, but her light remains. People only truly disappear when we stop learning from them. That afternoon, father and son decided to use the donation to build a new recovery center for wildfire victims in Texas, a state still scarred by a recent blaze. When the building was completed, they stood before its gleaming entrance. Above the doorway, engraved in bronze, were the words, "The light of both. Where fire ends, hope begins." And under the golden glow of sunset, Joseph thought of Linda and Margaret, two women bound by tragedy, finally joined by forgiveness, their shared light burning quietly, guiding everyone who dared to step out of the ashes and begin again. That autumn night, Boston glowed under a blanket of golden light. Inside the grand hall of the Linda Foundation, hundreds gathered to celebrate the charity's 20th anniversary. Spotlights swept across the audience, stopping on the front row, where Joseph Taylor, now nearly 85, sat in a simple wheelchair, hands resting on an old, worn notebook. When the host called his name, the entire room rose to their feet. Applause echoed like a heartbeat. Joseph stood, slow but steady, and made his way to the podium. He needed no notes, no speech cards. His voice, raspy, aged but rich with life, filled the hall. "I once lost everything in a single night of fire, my wife, my honor, and my faith in the world. But somehow, from those ashes, I learned what light truly means." He paused, eyes scanning the crowd, landing on Daniel, Emily, and their daughter, watching quietly from the front row. Light isn't always blinding. Sometimes it's just a faint spark, born from someone brave enough to speak the truth, even when no one listens, even when it costs them everything. Linda was the first light of my life. Margaret, the woman who once lost her way, became the second flame, the one that taught me remorse can also guide us home. And Daniel, my son, you are the final candle, proof that love can be reborn from ruin. His voice trembled for a moment, but his eyes shone brighter than ever. In all my years, I've learned one thing. Truth is not a weapon for revenge. It's a mirror for the soul. And compassion, it doesn't make us weak. It gives us the strength to hold even those who once broke us. The room fell silent. You could hear the soft hum of the autumn wind brushing against the windows. Joseph lowered his head, his wrinkled hand caressing the notebook, the one with Linda's name engraved on the cover. "If someone here tonight carries a wound in your heart," he said softly, "please remember, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing peace over anger, choosing to rebuild instead of burn." Then he looked up, straight into the cameras broadcasting live across the country. "If this story has touched you, don't stay silent. Speak up. Stand for the truth. Because sometimes, one courageous voice today can save a life tomorrow." A tear rolled down his cheek, but Joseph smiled. It was the gentle smile of a man who had finally found Linda again, not in memory, but within his own heart. The entire hall rose to their feet, applause thundering. Daniel rushed to the stage, wrapping his arms around his father as tears streamed freely. Outside, the wind stirred through the maple trees, carrying the glow of hundreds of candles lit around the courtyard. At the gate, a new plaque shimmered under the warm lights. "Family isn't defined by blood, but by respect, kindness, and the courage to forgive." Joseph gazed at the words, then smiled, tender and complete. "Linda, I kept my promise. Your flame will never die. If you ever believed justice only exists in books, remember this. Sometimes it lives quietly within us, in every act of love, forgiveness, and truth we dare to speak. Follow us for more stories, real, raw, and human, about redemption, courage, and the light that survives even the darkest fire, because the next story might just take your breath away."